As you know, Mr. Hitchcock, I am Zainab Farooq, and I welcome all of you, the speaker and our audience, dear audience. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you all to today's session of PAS. I am Zainab Farooq, today's moderator. The format of today's session is very simple. The session would be for an hour and it will have four sessions that are the first we'll have talk of respected speaker, then we'll have question answer session, then we'll have concluding remarks from the speaker, and then vote of thanks from President of PAS, Mr. Ehsan. As most of you know, that Professors Association for Student Services is an academic and volunteer association that aims to promote critical thinking and culture of scientific research by arranging seminars and conferences that either introduce this way of thinking, highlight its importance, or discuss over the complexities. The main purpose of this webinar is to understand controversies about critical thinking in academia as education goal. And this webinar also aims to find out biases and prejudices that hinder critical process in society and pedagogy. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker of the session, Professor David Hitchcock, Professor Emeritus at Department of Philosophy in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. Hello again, sir.
Yes, here I am.
So, dear audience, Dr. Hitchcock has been teaching philosophy at McMaster since 1968. His special interest in Amnesty International began at McMaster in 1974, and he has served on that association's national executive. He was the editor of McMaster's Sillyhood and has written for the Hamilton Spectator. He has published Critical Thinking, a textbook in informal logic. He was the founding president of the Association of Informal Logic and Critical Thinking, which sponsors periodic scholarly meetings and provides contact among researchers and scholars. And there are many other achievements to his name. So without further delay, let's start the session. But before we start, I would like to make the announcement that recorded version of this session will be uploaded on Facebook after the session. So floor is yours, Mr. Hitchcock.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. If I recall it correctly, you mentioned that I was the editor of the student newspaper at McMaster University, The Silhouette. And that takes me back a few years. That was in the academic year 1961 to 62.
Yeah.
A lot of water has gone under the bridge since then, but in fact, I live about 5 blocks from where the office of that newspaper was at the time. So I have moved sideways only slightly.
Yeah.
So thank you for the introduction, and I thank Professor Mughal for having invited me to give this talk, and to the Professors Association for Student Services, which is sponsoring the talk on whose behalf he invited me. I commend you for your work, which is absolutely admirable in all respects, and particularly, of course, in terms of the promotion of critical thinking as an educational objective. I gave Professor Mughal various choices of topics connected with critical thinking, and he selected this topic of controversies about critical thinking. My talk is an elaboration of the last section of the entry on critical thinking that I wrote for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And if you want to read more there, you can. It's an online open access encyclopedia. You can read it for free if you have internet access. So put just in the search engine, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, click on the link and put critical thinking in the search box that comes up, and you'll find this entry. And it has the full bibliographical information about the entries that I will cite just by author and date. So I identified in that entry 3 controversial issues in the discussion about critical thinking as an educational goal, which I call generalizability, bias, and relationships. So I'll discuss them one by one. The generalizability issue was uh, prompted by the publication in 1981 of a book by John McPeck, who is a philosopher of education at the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, not too far from where I live. And in this book, he leveled a broadside against attempts to teach thinking skills of all sorts, not just critical thinking skills, but higher order thinking skills, creative thinking skills, problem solving skills as a separate subject. And his position is that critical thinking skills in particular should be taught in the context of disciplines, and how they should be taught is as the epistemology of the disciplines. So when you're studying history, you should learn historiography. When you're studying mathematics, you should learn about the foundations of mathematics and what justifies mathematical claims. When you're studying he defined it as uh, judgment suspended during further inquiry. But still, he thought this disposition should be cultivated within subject matter instruction. His conception of the critical thinking disposition comes from John Dewey's book, How We Think, published in 1910, which is the book in which the term critical thinking was introduced as the name of an educational goal, although Dewey himself preferred the term reflective thinking. Well, people objected to this argument, including these two American philosophers, Harvey Siegel and Richard Paul. And they were actually objecting to the first step from the premise that thinking is always thinking about X, which seems unexceptionable, to the conclusion that there are no general thinking skills. And their refutation of this inference was in the form of an argument by logical analogy. You could say the same thing about writing and speaking. Writing is always writing about X, speaking is always speaking about X. But nevertheless, there are general writing and speaking skills. You can teach writing as a separate subject. You can teach speaking as a separate subject, and there are general skills that you can communicate. So how then is thinking different? So this was a kind of challenge to show why there weren't general thinking skills in the same way that there are general writing skills and general speaking skills. And to the best of my knowledge, McPeck did not reply to this challenge. Uh, the debate prompted a fine article by Robert Ennis, who, from my perspective, is the best thinker about the concept of critical thinking as an educational goal. And in this article published in 1989, he distinguished three ways in which one could claim that critical thinking is subject specific as a matter of concept, that just the very meaning of critical thinking means it's tied to a specific subject domain. And if that's the way it's subject specific, as McPeck argued, then it's going to be always subject specific. The second way is that it's subject specific in terms of the epistemological basis of thinking, what counts as norms of good thinking. And somebody might say, well, this depends on the field. The norms of good thinking about whether a painting is actually a genuine Picasso are a bit different than the norms of good thinking about how to prove the Pythagorean theorem. However, on the other side, somebody could say, well, look, there are norms of good thinking that straddle a lot of fields. So if you think about the design of clinical trials, of treatments for COVID-19 or the uh, testing of vaccines for safety and effectiveness. There are norms of good design and execution of clinical trials, randomized trials, but these norms apply not only within medicine, but they also apply within agriculture and education, where they actually were developed first. And so you can find both cases where the norms of good thinking seem to be very subject specific and cases where the norms cross a number of fields. But thirdly, Ennis thought that it might be an empirical matter of fact determined by observation that even if the norms in two fields are the same from an epistemological point of view, that some people might be very good at applying them in one field but not in another. So, for example, a real estate appraiser who's good at reasoning by analogy when determining the market value of a piece of real estate on the basis of recent sales of analogous properties might be a bit hung up in considering arguments by analogy for the existence and non existence of God. And you can understand why there might be differences, even though, let's suppose, the norms of what counts as a good argument by analogy would be the same on both questions. Some final remarks about this issue of generalizability. However, critical thinking is taught, however, we try to develop and improve the critical thinking dispositions and abilities of our students, we have to worry about transferring these to contexts outside the immediate instructional environment. We're not doing it just for these students to do well in the course. We're doing it to help them become better thinkers generally. And the way to facilitate transfer varies according to whether you're talking about a standalone instruction in critical thinking or in the context of subject matter instruction. The best way to get transfer, as far as I know, if you're doing standalone teaching, is to bridge to bridge from where the students are to what you're teaching, and from what you're teaching to where the students are going to be. So they come to you with some dispositions to think carefully about this issue or that issue, and some ability to do so. And you want them to just see what you're teaching as a development of what they already know and do. And you want to work from what they already have. But then you want them to take the skills or dispositions that you're trying to get them to acquire and improve, and apply them in contexts outside the instruction, whether through assignments, essays, journals, whatever, both in their academic work, in their personal life, and in their citizenship, in their future professional life. On the other hand, if you're teaching critical thinking skills and dispositions in the context of some subject, like political science or history or chemistry or whatever it may be, then you get transfer. You help if this sort of teaching is going on in multiple domains, not just in history, but also in chemistry and so on. And if you focus on dispositions and abilities that go across domains. So, for example, the disposition to suspend judgment during further inquiry is a disposition, I think, that could be cultivated in a number of subjects. And I wanted to make one, I think, final remark. It's a common ground within this debate that when you consider an issue carefully and inquire into it, you need background knowledge about the domain. So nobody, even those who think that There are general skills of critical thinking, and that it's quite reasonable have a standalone course in critical thinking. Nobody supposes that you can, for example, uh, design a randomized trial of a proposed treatment for COVID 19 without knowing anything about infectious diseases. You have to have background knowledge about the domain as well as the critical thinking skills, whether general or not, and the critical thinking dispositions. The second controversial issue that I identified was the question of whether there is bias in the sense of unjustified favoring of certain ways of thinking over others in the dominant theories, pedagogies, and practice of critical thinking instruction. And the accusers include Richard Paul, whose photograph I showed on a previous slide, and the rogues gallery of people at the bottom of the screen. They have something in common that you might be able to detect. If you can't do so, you can ask me in the question period what it is. It's something that differentiates them from all the people that I've talked about so far. So I'm going to give you a thumbnail sketch of what each of them had to say about what was wrong with the mainstream theories of critical thinking and what their remedy was. And you will see that there are some overlaps between their criticisms and their proposed remedies, but also some differences. And interested in what you have to say uh, in the Q&A about those differences and about the similarities. So Richard Paul in 1981 published an article in which he took issue with the way in which critical thinking was being taught in North America in universities and post-secondary education, which was you would teach atomistically different skills, how to identify an argument, how to pick out what was the conclusion, how to see what were the reasons offered in its support, uh, how to find a more complex structure, and then how to evaluate these, how to evaluate a premise, how to evaluate an inference, and so on. And his argument was that this sort of atomistic approach simply reinforced the egocentric and sociocentric biases of the students. They came in with a certain kind of worldview, uh, and nothing in the critical thinking course led them to challenge it. They just got better at finding flaws in the positions and arguments that they disagreed with, and better at defending the positions they already had against challenges. So his alternative was to get students to engage dialectically with opposing worldviews and to look at argument networks as opposed to individual arguments. And he has some interesting proposals for exercises and assignments to get students to realize that there are other ways of looking at the universe than their own. Karen Warren, in 1988, coming from a feminist perspective, was criticizing what she claimed was a theorist's tendency to treat critical thinking as if it occurred independently of its context. And she urged acknowledgement that conceptual frameworks affect all thinking and attention to biases in those conceptual frameworks, and especially what they feminists in those days called patriarchal biases. Maybe it's now misogynist biases, not quite sure. Jane Roeland Martin, in a paper called Critical Thinking for a Humane World, challenged what she claimed was the privileging by critical thinking theorists of distancing from the object of inquiry, indifference to the situation of others, and also orientation to thought. And she argued that somebody could be a good critical thinker on this conception who would be a monster. You know, you would be just a good critical thinker at organizing the Holocaust that took place under the Nazis during the Second World War. So her alternative was to uh, promote the opposites of the things that she thought were inadequate, and in pedagogy, foster closeness to the subject and feeling of connection to others. Her article was sufficiently telling that Ennis actually added a disposition uh, to the two global, comprehensive dispositions that he took to be characteristic of a critical thinker, which was the disposition to care equally about all persons. And he called this an auxiliary critical thinking disposition, not part of the concept of critical thinking itself, but something that would be necessary if critical thinking were to be something commendable. Barbara Thayer Bacon wrote a whole book called Constructive Thinking. Some similar charges to mainstream theories of critical thinking as those of the previous thinker, Jane Roeland Martin. Again, a recommendation of the opposites as what you should be promoting. And her concept of constructive thinking, the choice of the word reflects her view that knowledge is socially constructive. So, in contrast to the notion of a critical thinker as a solitary person sitting with his uh, chin on his arm, uh, you would recognize that you're not a pure mind. You have a body, and that you are socially embedded in various kinds of social groups, and that in your thinking you should value not just reason but also imagination, intuition, and emotion. And finally, in this group, Cal Elston uh, faulted the tendency in critical thinking pedagogy to attend just to written and spoken communications and give written and spoken assignments, and to focus on winning debates in the public sphere. Her alternative was to attend to human problems, assign other forms of expression, focus on making and understanding meaning. I believe she teaches literature, and in her article, she said that her female students were very able to deconstruct the Cinderella myth in the sense of finding all the faults with this uh, story and the values that it communicated, but that in their personal romantic lives, they were still looking for the Prince Charming. They hadn't taken the analytical skills that they could use on problems on pieces of literature and applied them to their own life, which is what she thought they should be doing if critical thinking was to be worth what it's claimed to be worth. The third and last uh, controversy doesn't actually involve uh, people taking opposite positions on a certain issue. It's more an issue of questioning. What exactly is the relationship between critical thinking and other forms of thinking that people give names to, of which the main candidates for a query are the other four shown on the screen? And this Euler diagram, sometimes falsely called a Venn diagram, gives you all the possible combinations of things that are thinking of one of the kinds, or two of the kinds, or three of the kinds, or four, or all five, or none of them. The none of them is whatsoever outside all of the circles. And the answer to the question as to what's the relationship between these kinds of thinking is quite obvious. I imagine some of you have already thought of this answer yourself. It all depends on how you define them. So, just to illustrate, if you take a very broad definition of critical thinking as any careful thinking that is directed at a goal, and you think about decision making, then it's pretty clear that if you are going about decision making in a careful way, that is, coming to make a decision, then that is critical thinking in the sense of careful thinking directed at a goal. It's careful thinking directed at making a decision. So there's definitely an overlap, although there would be other kinds of critical thinking that are directed at other goals than making a decision. For example, forming a judgment about whether the Pfizer vaccine is a safe vaccine. Uh, but there would also be cases of decision making that were not critical thinking. If it was slapdash, seat of the pants, intuitive, impulsive decision making, it would not be critical thinking because it would not be careful. And similarly, you could go around the circle and uh, pick your definition and work out to what extent there is overlap between any pair of these concepts. In the political and semi political literature about critical thinking as an educational goal, it is often coupled with creative thinking and problem solving. And so schools and post secondary institutions are being exhorted and encouraged to teach critical thinking, creative thinking, and problem solving. And depending on how you define these, uh, there's likely to be considerable overlap among them. So I've given you the lay of the land about three controversies in the critical thinking scholarly literature, the issue of generalizability, the issue of bias, and the issue of relationships. And I'd be very happy to hear your comments and questions and respond to them as best that I can.
Thank you so much, sir. Now, dear audience, um, the house is open for question answer session. There are two ways to ask questions. Either you can raise your hand or you can drop your question in the chat box. So I will convey that question to Mr. Hitchcock. Was I audible before? Am I audible?
Yes, yes, Zainab, you're audible.
Okay, thank you, Doha.
I see a question in the chat from Professor Mughal. Perhaps I could answer that. Uh, and I'm going to answer it with a question. His question is there any difference between hard and soft generalization in critical thinking? And I need to know what uh, uh, you mean by hard generalization and soft generalization. I don't understand this terminology.
Uncle, you can unmute yourself.
Professor Mughal? I see the faces of two lovely children on the screen.
Hello?
Yes, hello. I'm
Ah,
listening.
hello. Thank you very much, Dr. David. My question was about a hard generalization that is a one way to correctly convey by using quantifier, such as all, every, each, or no, unlike the soft generalization. I'm just asking about any other difference that you could convey us and enable us to understand this, please.
Okay, so I think you're asking about the difference between explicitly universal quantifiers like you know, every dose of the vaccine will protect you against infection, and generic universals like doses of the vaccine will protect you against infection, where that tolerates exceptions. So
Exactly,
I
sir.
think the issue about generalizability is an issue as to whether uh, a given critical thinking skill is universal. I'm having to think this out loud because I've never thought of this question myself. So if somebody says, well, the skill of identifying a conclusion is a general skill in, you know, in a piece of text or a spoken discourse, uh, they would, I think, be making an absolutely universal claim, what you call a hard generalization. Every uh, instance of identifying the conclusion of an argument in someone's writing or speaking uh, uses the same skill. Uh, so I think a general claim of that sort would be universal. But on the other hand, uh, there are some claims that are perhaps what you might call soft generalizations. So if somebody says that the design and execution of a randomized trial involves skills that cut across several disciplines and is not just specific to medical research, they're not claiming that all uh, thinking involves designing and executing a randomized trial. They're saying, well, this is uh, something that goes beyond the particular field of medical research. It goes into educational research and agricultural research and perhaps other kinds of research as well. So I hope that answers your question.
Good, sir. Thank you very much.
Shall I just, Zainab,
Yes,
pick the other question off the chat?
yes, we have another question of Muhammad Tayyib. So
Yes,
yeah.
Mohammed Tayyab. He asks, is it necessary that critical thinking would make us skeptical of our core concepts? Uh, I would say no. And indeed, there are arguments for not thinking critically about our core concepts. So it's, you know, the missionaries for critical thinking want us to challenge everything, and particularly Richard Paul's approach. Uh, but I have heard quite respectable arguments from religious students, for example, that they treat their faith as the framework in which they approach all questions, and it's not something that they're going to subject to critical examination. Uh, I I have some sympathy with this position. I think that it's more satisfying both personally and in terms of intellectual respectability to uh, have a worked out and refashionable grasping of one's core concepts and basic perspective one takes on the world. Uh, Mine, to speak autobiographically, has changed somewhat over the decades, but there are probably commonalities between the way I thought back in 1961 and the way I think now. Um, I do have a sympathy for students beginning post-secondary education who often find that they beliefs that they've gotten from their parents, their religion, their peers, or whatever, are being challenged in their subject matter instruction, and they have to come to grips with those challenges, and they sometimes feel them as quite threatening to their personal sense of well-being. So encouraging people to think critically and to develop their dispositions and abilities to think critically is something that has to be done with a certain amount of sensitivity to the mental anxiety that such things can provoke. Okay, I see a question from Rashid Mughal. Is there any way to get rid of using rhetorical ploys and fallacies or shame reasoning in our academic discussion? I mean, how could we be able to make our argument inductively forceful? How to deal with it, rhetorical ploys and fallacies is a problematic question. There's the question of how to deal with them intellectually, that is, how to recognize that that's what you're dealing with, and how does it distinguish a rhetorical ploy or a fallacy from something that looks like it but is actually quite a respectable way of making a point. But there's also the question of what is an effective way to communicate with somebody who is using rhetorical ploys and fallacies, and what is an effective way to communicate with an audience when you're involved in a discussion in front of this audience with someone else who is using rhetorical ploys and fallacies. I don't have a great deal of wisdom on this. I certainly haven't done any empirical research on what works and what does not work. My sense is that what might help in an immediate context is to use analogies. So I know people, for example, who don't want any Muslims to come and live in Canada because Islam is an intolerant religion. And I can say to those people, well, you could say the same thing about Christianity if they are Christians, or you could say the same thing. People have said analogous things about Jews if it's somebody who is Jewish. Now that that argument is not in itself a rhetorical ploy or a fallacy that Canada should not be admitting Muslims because Islam is an intolerant religion. But the example, I think, illustrates how one can use analogies to get people to think again about some position they're putting forward. I suppose if somebody is using a straightforward formal fallacy like affirming the consequent, I have to try to think of an example. So they might say it looks like this is a hypothetical example. It looks like a duck. It walks like a duck. It talks like a duck. So it must be a duck. And you can say, well, it could be a decoy. So if it's a duck, it quacks. If a duck, it waddles. If it's a duck, it looks in a certain way. But the fact that all these things are true, you can't legitimately infer that it's a duck. And in this particular case, there are things that have all these characteristics that are not actually ducks. But I'd be happy with any comments that any of you have on possibility of responding to fallacies and rhetorical ploys.
Thank you, Dr. David. Sir, sometimes we are moved to accept or reject claims when we have been given no good grounds for doing so.
Right.
Often, this is because speakers or writers attempt to persuade us in ways which appear to provide good reasons, but which do not really. Uh, we will call these persuasive devices as shame reasoning, our process of implying them shame reasonings. I think you have enlightened me more about rhetorical employs and shame reasoning and fallacies. I thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. It's astonishing to me, and probably to you, how wild theories about this COVID-19 virus and about the vaccines are circulating through social media and on the web, and being believed by people who seem otherwise perfectly rational. Somebody in my larger social circle who is of Russian origin and listens to a program by a Russian nationalist commentator on a Russian television station has accepted his claim that the that virus vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines, have been produced by the United States in order to bring harm to people. So to protect yourself, you should make sure not to get vaccinated. And if two people who are vaccinated come together, there's going to be real danger to their health. Well, this is so absurd. The thousands, if not millions, of people who would have to be in on this conspiracy if it were true, it boggles the mind how somebody could believe this. I don't understand, and it's a big challenge for those of us who would like to have people thinking carefully about issues that come to their attention. Okay, I see another question from Hassan Ur Rahim. Is it not good that critical thinking challenge core concepts and develops another antithesis? It can be. I was sympathetic to the questioner who asked whether critical thinking necessarily involves challenging core concepts, and was arguing that there's something to be said for somebody who says, well, look, I have a certain faith and that's what I work within, and I'm not challenging that, and I'm not addressing that. I think the kind of dialectical engagement with alternative worldviews that Richard Paul recommends has to be handled with a great deal of sensitivity. It should be done within a small group in which there are guidelines laid down at the beginning for being respectful to one another, and willingness to listen. To the extent that one would be able to communicate to somebody who had a very different perspective than you did, what their perspective was, and to communicate it in such a way that they would say, yes, you've understood me correctly. That's how I think. In Canada, I give, when I was teaching, I'm now retired, I would be teaching a large class of, let's say, 400 students, a standalone course in critical thinking. Uh, and I would have them do a staged essay on an issue they themselves would formulate within a topic. And to make the marking by the teaching assistants manageable, I limited the topics to three, which they chose by a vote online from a list that they themselves had submitted. And generally speaking, abortion was one of those topics. When I taught in China as a demonstration course in critical thinking, abortion was not even on the agenda. My class there offered 29 topics, and they did not include abortion. And I've often thought that it would be an interesting exercise to get a strongly so-called pro-life student who thought that abortion was murder and should be prohibited, and pro-choice student, so-called, who thought that any restriction on abortion was an interference with the woman's right to control her own body, and have them have a discussion back and forth where they would each be trying to understand the other's point of view. That might be a way for them to address their core concepts and to think critically about them. Uh, I'm sure that it would be a very tough thing for two students with such diametrically opposed views on this issue to do. And maybe it should be something that I never tried it. I did try that sort of process when I was chair of my department, and we had a conflict between two of the staff in the departmental office. And that was very successful, but I never tried it in the context of teaching critical thinking. And I think you might have to make it a kind of voluntary exercise because it could be very difficult emotionally. Do you agree? Here's a question from Professor Mughal. Do you agree that dialectical way of discussion will need ample material knowledge of socioeconomic context of the area wherein we are making our argument? Absolutely. So Richard Paul would get people to engage with a debate on some fraught issue. For example, back I think around 2012, there was the bombing of Libya, which I believe it was a NATO mission led by Canadians. So he would provide the students with a bunch of articles that they would read. So yes, you would definitely have to have background knowledge. And the articles would express different points of view, but my understanding is that they would be generally of a high quality in terms of passing on factual information that was correct. So yes, you have to know about the situation in Libya before the decision was made to the Security Council to permit NATO to go on this bombing mission, and how this mission evolved after that. I see a thank you. You're welcome.
So, audience, do we have any other question?
I think we don't have any other question on in chat box. You can proceed.
Does anybody want me to say how these four people who alleged bias were different from the other people I talked about?
Yes, sir. Why not?
Yeah, well, I think you all noticed they're all women. Maybe it's a stereotype, but the men were not talking about caring for others, about critical thinking being a collaborative rather than a solitary endeavor. They were not talking about taking into account emotion and imagination and intuition. And so I think this, personally, these four women collectively make a very important corrective to the notion of the solitary thinker who's a pure mind as the critical thinker.
Okay, so thank you so much, Mr. Hitchcock, for your thoughts and your time. And we really enjoyed your session because it was more conversational in its essence. So
Well,
now,
I enjoyed talking to you and enjoyed the questions.
thank you. So we'll conclude this session. And I think we don't have our president with us. So he would conclude. Um, thank you, sir. We really enjoyed having you. And we would love to have you again.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, sir. So, Mr. Rashid, would you step up and conclude on behalf of our president?
Professor Ehsan is there.
He is? Oh, I'm really
Yeah.
sorry. I think I missed your name spellings, I guess.
Ehsanur Rahim.
Mr. Ehsanur Rahim, please conclude the session. And I'm really sorry for not recognizing your name spellings.
Actually, whilst you have stopped the video, so far as the video is concerned.
I think you can start your video.
Not coming. Start your video because the host has stopped it. It is written here. Can you listen me?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
You can start your video, sir, now.
मैंने आपको बता दिया आप गाड़ी चला लो Thank you very much. Being president of PAS Professor Association for Student Services, I would say a lot of thanks to Dr. Hitchcock. So far as your topic is concerned, controversies about critical thinking, you have allotted a lot to our knowledge, added a lot to our knowledge, and we are very thankful to you for sparing your precious time. So far as the questions are concerned, very good questions, and we have got a lot from your replies. So this PAS is concerned since 2017. PAS has been doing its best to provide a forum to students as well as scholars for a dialogue, because without dialogue we cannot improve ourselves. Dialogue is very important, and critical thinking is concerned. There is a way about critical thinking, no doubt in it, as one of your ideas that you have shared is that it is not just about that you are going to make it a separate subject. I have listened from your shared about it. So critical thinking for the students is very important, but I would also link this critical thinking with Bloom's taxonomy, and it leads to the very particular thing is to make a person creative being. So since the inception of PAS, it has been efforts made by PAS to make people think critically, to question everything that is happening around them. So, and many scholars, they are helping and they are doing their best. They are providing their precious time. Thank you very much, dear David Hitchcock, for your contribution to pass. You will always be welcome at this forum. And so far as ComSets is concerned, thank you very much for ComSets for inviting to Zoom. Thank you all, participants, students, and scholars. Thanks a lot.
And thank you.
Okay, so I think it's time for us to leave the session. I hope we see you again, Mr. Hitchcock.
Well, you may.
You, yes, there are possibilities. So I'm going to end the session, and guys, recording will be uploaded on Facebook. Okay, bye.